The most dangerous man in Calder Bluff was not the one they called Heartless. It was the smiling cattle baron who stole from widows, silenced children, and called it law. The weak would not stand alone. This story proves that courage is not always a gunfight. Sometimes it is standing in daylight with the truth. Like, comment, share, and subscribe for more.
They called him Heartless Heart, and he never once told them they were wrong. You learned it fast in Calder Bluff. Mothers learned it. They'd see his sorrel come up the main road, and they'd find a reason to step inside. Children learned it too. They'd go quiet. Boy might dare another boy to wave at him, and the other boy never would. He didn't blame them. A man earns the name folks give him, or he doesn't. Either way, the name sticks. It was the last warm week of autumn. 1887. The cottonwoods had gone gold, and the wind hadn't found its teeth yet. But it was coming. You could smell it. Gideon Hart could. Anyway, 7 winters alone will teach a man to read the sky. He'd come to town for nails and coffee and nothing else. He was loading the wagon outside McCready's store when the drifter found him. The man was thin, coat too big, boots too small. That gray look around the mouth that hunger leaves. He held his hat in both hands like it might fly off. Beg pardon, mister. Any work? I'll dig. I'll haul. I ain't particular. Gideon kept loading. Got no work. A meal, then? I don't, I said. I got nothing. His voice was flat. Not cruel. Worse than cruel, maybe. Just shut like a door. Nobody answers. The drifter nodded the way beaten men nod. He turned and shuffled off toward the rail yard. 2 women by the dry goods window watched the whole thing. One leaned to the other. Heartless, as they say, she murmured. Wouldn't give a starving man the time of day. The other clucked her tongue. Ribbon. What they didn't see was Gideon setting a silver dollar on the bench by the store door, half under the drifter's forgotten glove, where the man would find it, and nobody else would. He didn't look around to see if anyone watched. That was the point. Isn't a kindness. It's a mirror you're holding up to yourself. He climbed up and clicked his tongue, and the sorrel took the wagon out of town. The road home ran past the old depot. Nobody used it anymore. The line had moved north 2 years back and left the little building to the wind, its windows dark, its platform sagging. Gideon passed it most days and never gave it a thought. He gave it one now, because he heard a sound. Not loud. That was the thing about it. It wasn't the kind of crying that wants company, that climbs up loud so somebody will come. It was the other kind. Low, tired all the way down. The kind a person makes when they've stopped believing anybody's coming at all. His hands pulled the reins before his head had finished deciding. Whoa. He set the brake. He sat a moment. He could have driven on. A wiser man would have. He'd built his whole life around driving. He climbed down, back, against the wall, where the platform, a young woman, dark dress gone, small trunk beside her, and a crate and a rolled. He knew the look of an eviction. Notice the way he knew the look. Heard his boot and her head. There should have been fear. Strange man, big, scarred, across the back of one hand, coming around an empty building at the edge of nowhere. There should have been fear. There wasn't. There was something worse. There was no, like the world had done so much to her already, that one more hard thing didn't even rate. Voice was wrecked from crying, but she held it. There was a kind of dignity in it that had no business being out. If that's what you stopped for, you can move along. I didn't stop for that. Then what? He didn't have an answer she'd believe. He wasn't sure he had one he believed. So he did the only honest thing. He took the canteen off his belt. He set it on the platform edge, an arm's length from her, not handed. Set down. A handed thing can be refused. A set-down thing just waits. He pulled the handkerchief from his pocket, clean, folded, and laid it beside the canteen. Anywhere from here, he said. Whatever you do next, Do it watered. That was all. He turned to go. That's when he saw the boy. The child had come around the far corner of the depot, quiet as a cat. 8, maybe, stood watching Gideon with a stillness that wasn't shyness, was study. Boy was reading him the way Gideon read the sky. Toby, the woman said. Then she did something with her hand, fingers moving sure and fast. And the boy answered, not with his mouth, his hand. Gideon stood there and understood, slow and certain, that the child couldn't hear him, never heard a single word anyone in Calder Bluff had said about anybody, and was looking at Gideon right now, like he understood plenty anyway. Boy lifted one hand, made a sign Gideon didn't know, held his eyes the whole time. Something in Gideon's chest moved on a hinge he'd thought rusted shut. He put his hat back on. He climbed up to the wagon. He took up the rein. He told himself it was none of his business. He drove home knowing he'd lied. Nell Calloway had learned to count what was left instead of what was gone. It was the only arithmetic that let a person sleep. So that night, in the back of the depot, with the wind coming up cold, she counted 1 trunk, 1 crate, 1 quilt, 1 boy. The canteen the stranger had set down half full. The handkerchief, clean. 5 things and a boy. That was the whole of it. She'd had a husband once. She'd had a house with a real roof and a stove that drew right. She'd had a future that came in straight lines, the way a young woman's future does before the world gets a hold of it. Then the army sent a letter, and the bank sent a man, and the straight lines bent and broke, and here she was, counting trunks behind a dead railway station, with her son asleep against her side. She didn't cry again. She'd done her crying for the day, and the stranger had caught her at it, and that still burned. Not because he'd been unkind, because he hadn't. There's a particular shame in being seen weak by someone who doesn't use it against you. You don't know where to put it. She felt him wake before she saw it, that little change in the weight of him. He sat up and signed in the dark. Where do we go? She didn't have the answer, so she gave him the one her own mother had given her, years back, when there were no answers in their house either. Somewhere, she signed. We always go somewhere. He looked at her a long moment. Then he nodded, like that was good enough, like somewhere was a real place a person could walk to. And it broke her heart a little. How he trusted her word against all the evidence. She pulled the quilt up over them both. She watched the stars come out hard and white over the grass. Watered, the stranger had said. Whatever you do next, do it watered. Strange man, cold as the others said. But the others had walked past her all day in town, eyes sliding off her, like she was a thing best not looked at directly. And this one cold one had stopped. She turned that over until sleep took her. Morning came thin and gray. She did what you do. She got up. She got the boy up. She found the road and they walked it. By mid-morning, they were back in Calder Bluff, because there was nowhere else within walking. And a person has to start the day somewhere, even when the day has nothing for them. She tried the boarding house. Full, the woman said, in the tone that means not for you. She tried the laundry, asking after work. The man looked at Toby, asked what was wrong with him. And when Nell said nothing was wrong with him, he wasn't deaf as a sin. The man said he'd no work anyhow. That was how it went. Did something to people's faces. They rearranged, careful and kind in. The wrong way, the way you're kind to a broken thing. It was nearly noon when the schoolteacher found her on the boardwalk. Miss Pruitt was young and meant well, which is its own kind of trouble. She had Toby's slate in her hands, holding it out like she was returning a borrowed cup. Mrs. Calloway, I'm so glad I caught you. She wasn't glad. Her smile had work in it. About Toby, I've thought it over, and I'm afraid, that is, with a full room and his particular needs, I don't believe I'm equipped to teach a boy who can't follow the lesson. Nell took the slate. Her hands were steady. She'd gotten good at steady. He follows fine, she said, if a person writes it down. He reads better than half your room. It isn't the reading. It's the disruption. The other children stare. It isn't fair to them. There it was. Honest part slipped out under the polite part, the way honest parts do. Not fair to them. Nell looked at the young woman for a moment. She decided not to be angry. Anger was expensive and she was poor. My boy can't hear with his ears, Nell said. Quiet, even. That's true. But he understands a sight, more than plenty of folks with two good ears, who just choose not to listen. She let that sit. You included. Miss Pruitt. The teacher's face went pink. She didn't have an answer. People rarely do. To a plain true thing, said Plain. Nell handed Toby the slate. She signed. We're going. And they went. She felt Toby's eyes on her as they walked. At the corner, he tugged her sleeve. What did she say? Nell crouched down to his level, the way she always did. Because a child deserves your face and not the top of your head. She said the school is full. Nell signed. It wasn't the whole truth. But there are truths you don't lay on an 8-year-old. The whole world will tell him soon enough what it thinks of boys like him. He didn't need it from his mother on a cold morning. Toby studied her. He always knew when she softened a thing, but he let her have it. He was kind like that. Kinder than the people who pitied him. Can we see the horses? He signed, because there'd been horses. The stranger's horses, hitched to that wagon. And Toby had looked at them the way other children look at candy. Maybe. Nell signed. Someday. The man who ruined the morning came in a fine black buggy. Royce Dunmore. She knew him by sight the way everybody in the valley knew him. He owned the biggest spread in the county and a piece of nearly everything else. He had a soft, handsome face and a soft, easy voice, and the kind of warmth a man wears, like a good coat, put on each morning, taken off at night. Never quite part of him. He pulled up beside her on the road, and he smiled like they were old friends. Mrs. Calloway. Now this is no good. Lady walking the road with a child. He tutted. I heard about the foreclosure. Terrible business. Banks have no soul. She said nothing. She'd learned that men like this talk to fill a silence, and if you let them, they tell you things. That parcel of yours, he went on, out by the creek. Good water on it, I hear. Pity to lose it to the bank for pennies. He let the warmth pour. I'd hate to see you cheated. Tell you what, I'll buy it off you. Fair price. Paid honest. And you and the boy ride to town in this very buggy. Start fresh somewhere with a roof. It sounded like rescue. That was the trick of it. The hook always comes dressed as the hand. How much, she said. Not because she'd sell. Because she wanted to know what he thought she was worth. He named a figure. It was an insult wearing the clothes of a favor. Less than the land's worth by half. Less than the water alone was worth. And they both knew the water was the whole game. That parcel's my son's, she said. I don't aim to sell his birthright cheap to a man who calls it a favor. The warmth flickered, just at the edges. Just for a second. Smoother than before. Of course, Dunmore said. Of course. You think on it. These things have a way of getting decided for folks. If folks don't decide for themselves. He tipped his hat. Good day, Mrs. Calloway. The buggy rolled on. She stood in the dust and felt the cold of what he'd said settle in. Decided for folks. It wasn't an offer. It was a warning wearing an offer's coat. She took Toby's hand. It was small and warm in hers. She didn't know yet that help was already turning his wagon back up the road toward her. Gideon hadn't meant to come back. He told himself it was the handkerchief. A man doesn't keep another person's handkerchief. It wasn't right. So he'd folded it and put it in his coat and ridden out at first light. And if he happened to find the woman and the boy, he'd hand it back and be done. That was the story. He even half believed it. He found them on the edge of town. The woman's face set hard, the boy close at her side. He pulled up. He got down. He held out the handkerchief like it weighed something. You forgot this, he said. Back at the depot. She looked at it. She looked at it. There was a beat where he could see her deciding whether to be proud or be practical. And practical won the way It has to when you've got a child. Thank you. She took it. Mr. Hart. Something moved across her face. She'd heard the name. Everybody had. Heartless Hart. He watched her, hear it, and waited for the door to close in her eyes the way it always did. It didn't. You're the one stopped, she said instead, like that was the only fact about him that counted. Most didn't. He had no reply for that. He looked away, and that's when he saw the boy again, Toby. The child had crouched by the side of the road with a stick of charcoal and a flat scrap of board, and he was drawing. Quick, sure, not the way children draw, all big heads and wandering line. This was something else. Gideon stepped closer, looked down. It was his horses, the pair from yesterday's team. And not just any horses his. The blaze on the off one. The notch in the near one's ear where a wired caught it 3 summers back. The boy had seen them for the space of a minute. Yesterday, in passing. And got it right. Every line. He drew those from yesterday, Gideon said. Nell looked. Sees a thing once. Keeps it. A flatness came into her voice. The flatness of a thing she'd said too many times to too many doubters. Folks think because he can't hear. He can't think. They've got it backwards. He misses nothing. We're the ones missing things. Gideon crouched. Slow. The way you get down near a wary animal. Toby looked up at him. Held the charcoal still. Gideon pointed at the drawing, then at himself, and he made the only sign he could think to make. He didn't know any, so he just laid his open hand flat over his heart and pressed it there. Good. This is good. Toby watched him do it. Then the boy smiled. All there and gone like sun through a fast cloud. But it landed somewhere in Gideon that hadn't had sun in it for years. He stood up too fast. His knees told him about it. I've got a place needs hands before winter, he heard himself say. He didn't recognize his own voice. Roof's gone soft on the bunkhouse. Garden run wild. Honest work. Honest pay. He looked at the dirt, not at her. Room enough for a boy. Nell went still. Pride and need fought it out, again behind her eyes. I don't take charity, she said. It isn't charity if you're working. He met her eyes then. I'm short-handed. And you're walking the road. That's just 2 facts that fit. It wasn't quite true. Josiah ran the place fine. But it wasn't quite a lie either. And it was the closest a man like Gideon Hart could come to saying the true thing, which was, I heard you crying, and I can't seem to drive on. Nell looked at her son. The boy was watching the horses. 1 season, she said. We'll see how it sits. 1 season, Gideon agreed. He helped her load the trunk. The boy climbed up on his own and put his hand flat on the seat, on the warm wood, like he was making sure it was real. They rode out toward Hart's Crossing, the 3 of them, and not one of them said another word the whole way. But it was a different kind of quiet than the morning had held. It was the kind with room in it. Hart's Crossing sat in a fold of the land where the creek came down out of the hills. It wasn't grand, but it was kept. Fences true, barn sound, house too big for one man, with most of its windows dark. Josiah Freeman was mending harness on the porch when the wagon came up the track. He watched it come the way. He watched most things careful, taking his time, giving nothing away till he knew what he was looking at. A woman, a boy, on Gideon Hart's wagon. In 9 years working that ranch, Josiah had never once seen Gideon bring a soul home. He set the harness down. Gideon pulled up, got down. Josiah, this is Mrs. Calloway. Her boy, Toby. They'll be on through the winter. Bunkhouse work, garden, the soft roof. Like a man getting through cold water. Mrs. Calloway, my foreman, Josiah Freeman. You'll want to know he runs this place more than I do. What he says goes. Nell took the measure of the man on the porch. Tall, gray, coming in at his temples. A stillness to him that wasn't Gideon's kind. Gideon's stillness was a wall. This man's was a held breath. She put out her hand. Mr. Freeman. Josiah looked at the offered hand a beat longer than a body should. Then he took it. She felt the surprise in his grip. Like a handshake from a white woman, was a thing he'd had taken from him often enough that he'd stopped expecting it. And she understood. All at once. A piece of how the world had used this man. The same world that called her boy dumb and called Gideon heartless had its own ugly name for Josiah Freeman, and she could guess it without being told. Toby came around the wagon. He stopped in front of Josiah and looked up at him. Then he signed, "Hello," the plain, open sign, the one anybody could near enough guess. Josiah blinked, and then, slow, he raised his own hand and gave it back. Clumsy, but he gave it back. "What's that he did?" he asked Nell. "He said hello." "Huh." Josiah looked at the boy, looked at his own hand. "Hello," he said back, out loud, and signed it again, a little surer. Toby grinned, and Nell thought, "There's a man who knows what it is to be looked past, so he doesn't do it to others." The first days were work, and work is its own language. Nell could do anything that needed doing, and most things twice as fast as a body expected. She got the garden turned, she got the bunkhouse aired, and the soft roof stripped back to the rot so a man could fix it proper. She didn't ask for ease, and she didn't take any. Gideon watched her work and said little. That was his way. But she noticed he found reasons to be near: a board to carry, a post to hold. He'd appear at the hard part of a job and put his back into it, without a word, and be gone again before she could thank him. Boy, was the surprise. Toby took to the barn like it was the place he'd been looking for his whole short life. The horses didn't care that he couldn't hear. Anyhow, they speak the way Toby spoke, with the body, the eyes, the set of an ear, the lean of a shoulder. He and the animals understood each other from the first day. Gideon found him out there the third morning, sitting on an upturned bucket, watching the sorrel eat. Gideon didn't know how to talk to him, so he did the thing he did know. He picked up the feed scoop. He held it out. He pointed at the horse, then at the boy, then mimed the... Toby took the scoop. "Careful. Hand flat the way you do, so you..." Then Toby looked at Gideon and pointed at the sorrel. Made it again. Deliberate. Gideon hand curved, a little motion. Toby shook his head, fixed Gideon's fingers with his own small ones, made him do it right. Gideon did it right. Toby nodded. "That's the horse's name now." The nod said, "You can say his name." And Gideon Hart, who hadn't learned a new thing on purpose in years, who had let his whole self go stiff and shut like an unused gate. Gideon stood in his own barn and learned, from an 8-year-old who couldn't hear, how to say a horse's name with his hands. He practiced it that night, alone by the lamp. Felt like a fool. Did it anyway. Josiah found him at it, came in for the ledger, saw Gideon at the table moving his hand in that small, curved shape over and over. "You learning the boys' talk," Josiah said. "Not a question." Picking up a little, Josiah set down the ledger. He didn't sit. He had a thing to say, and he said it standing, which was his way when a thing mattered. "You know what they call you in town." "I know. Heartless Heart." Josiah let it hang. "Been hearing it 9 years. Every supply run. Every time I go for the mail. You work for Heartless Heart. How do you stand it?" His mouth went flat. I never did say much back. Gideon waited. He'd learned that with Josiah, you waited. "I'll tell you what I think, since you never asked, and I'm going to say it anyhow." Josiah pulled out the chair then, sat, looked at him level. "I was there in that storm. 7 years gone. I rode out behind you. I saw you go to every door in this valley, with your wife dying and the snow coming sideways. I saw which doors opened and which didn't." A muscle worked in his jaw. A heartless man doesn't ride into a blizzard for somebody. A heartless man stays warm. He shook his head, slow. "Heartless is not the word. I'd know. I've met the genuine article. They don't carry it the way you do." Lamp ticked. The night pressed at the windows. Gideon didn't answer. Not right then. But something in him heard it, where he kept the things he didn't look at, and held it a minute, and put it back gentler than before. He managed. "Rough. Don't thank me. It's just true." Josiah stood, took up the ledger. At the door, he paused. "That woman and her boy. They've been used hard by folks who ought to know better. Boy especially." He looked back. "Be careful you don't become another thing that happened to them. You've got it in you, to be the thing that didn't. Most men only ever managed the one. Then he was gone, out into the dark, and Gideon sat with that a long while. The change came at the supper table, and it came so quiet that none of them named it. Nell had taken to cooking. It made sense. She ate the food. The boy ate it. No reason to make 3 separate sad meals when one good one would do. The first nights, she'd fixed plates and carried Gideon's out to wherever he was because she'd learned the shape of his solitude and meant to respect it. The man ate standing at the counter every night. She'd seen it and said nothing, because a person's grief is their own, and you don't go poking it. But the 4th night, the boy was at the table, and Nell was at the table, and the food was on the table, steam coming off it, the lamp making the one warm room in that whole big dark house. Gideon came in with his plate, headed for the counter the way he always did, and Toby got up. The boy went and took Gideon by the sleeve, tugged him toward the empty chair, the 3rd chair, that had sat empty every night. Gideon stopped. Nell saw it, saw the war in him. She knew that war. She'd fought it herself the year after the letter came. The war between the grief that keeps you safe and small and the living that asks you to risk something again. He wants you to sit, she said. Easy. No weight on it, letting him take it or leave it. But suit yourself. Some folks like to stand. Gideon looked at the chair. 7 years he hadn't sat at a full table. 7 years of eating like a man doing penance, on his feet alone. Because to sit down was to admit there was a life worth sitting down to, and he hadn't believed there was. The boy tugged again, patient. Sure. The way he'd fixed Gideon's fingers on the sign until he got it right. Gideon sat. He set his plate down on the wood. He put his hands flat on the table, either side of it. He looked at them like they belonged to somebody else. Nobody made a thing of it. That was the gift of it. Nell just passed the bread. Toby went back to his food. The lamp burned, and the wind walked around the house and couldn't get in. Gideon ate at his own table for the first time since he'd buried his wife. And later, when he tried to find words for what had turned in him. That night, the closest he could come was this, and he never said it out loud. Only knew it the way you know the weather changing your bones. A man can mistake a coffin for a home, if he stays in it long enough. It takes somebody else to show him the door's been open the whole time. He didn't sleep much that night, but for once, it wasn't grief that kept him up. It was something he was almost afraid to call by its name. It felt like hope. The trouble started, as trouble out west so often did, with water. It was the 2nd week of Nell's season at Hart's Crossing. The mornings had gone sharp and cold, frost on the rails of the corral, and the work had found its rhythm. Then a rider came up the track she didn't know, on a horse too fine for honest work, and the morning bent out of true. Gideon met him in the yard. Josiah drifted over from the barn, slow, hands loose. Nell watched from the garden and didn't pretend not to. The rider didn't get down. Men who don't get down are telling you something. Message from Mr. Dunmore, he said. He had a paper. He held it out, and Gideon didn't take it. So he just read it aloud, bored, like it was somebody else's business. Concerning the Callaway parcel at the creek fork. Mr. Dunmore's filed on the water rights upstream. Says the flow that crosses the Callaway land originates on Dunmore Range, and he's within his rights to dam and divert it. The rider folded the paper. Real sorry, ma'am. He says you've got till the end of the month to reconsider his offer. After that, the creek runs his way. The yard went quiet. Nell came across, it slow, wiping her hands on her apron. That creek's run through my land 40 years. Ever bought his first acre. Ryder shrugged. He was just the mouth. The hand was elsewhere. Take it up with the land office, ma'am. Turned his fine horse and rode out. They stood there, the 3 of them, with the cold coming up out of the ground. Nell said, "Kenny." Josiah and Gideon traded a look. It was Josiah who answered, because Josiah had spent his life learning exactly how much the law would do for a person and how much it wouldn't. He can do most anything he's got the money to do, Josiah said, and the patience to dress up legal. The question ain't can he. The question is who'll stand up and say he can't. He looked at Gideon when he said it. Gideon said nothing. It got worse before the day was out. Nell rode into town that afternoon, Gideon's mare. His insistence. You'll not walk it to ask, at the land office, what a body could do. She found the office shut early. She found, instead, the talk. It was everywhere. In the way the woman at the dry goods didn't quite meet her eye. In the two ranchers, by the livery who stopped talking when she passed, and started again when she'd gone by. Lower, woman, can't hold that land anyhow. Dunmore's doing her a kindness. Way I hear it. No business a woman trying to run a place alone. Ought to sell and be sensible. She stood on the boardwalk and let it wash over her, in pieces. Hearing it whole was different, wanting her water. It was a whole town that had already decided she shouldn't have it, that a woman alone was a problem to be solved, and selling out was the solution, and her, wanting to keep what was hers, was the unreasonable thing. She got back on the mare. She rode home with her Josette. Somewhere on that road, the anger cooled into something harder and clearer, because she'd thought of Toby, of the parcel that was his by right, his father's last gift to him, the one straight line left in the boy's bent world. He thought they'd take a deaf boy's birthright and call it sense. They'd take it and feel good about it. That was the thing she couldn't abide, not the taking. The feeling good, she told it all at supper. The filing, town that had already weighed her and found her wanting. Toby watched her hands as she told the part she could sign, and watched her face for the part she couldn't, and he understood enough. Child understands when the ground is shaking under the grown people. You don't need ears for that. Gideon listened without a word, the way he did. But Nell had learned to read the small weather of his face by now, and she saw a thing moving in it. There's more, Josiah said quietly, from the end of the table. Ought to hear it, since you're in it now, whether you like it or no. He turned his cup in his hand. Isn't the only water Dunmore wants. There's the Crow family up past the North Ridge. Walks in two worlds and her people. Longer than any deed in the county. Been pushing them. Fences creeping. Cattle wandering onto their grass. Papers they can't read. Shoved at them by men who count on that. His voice stayed level, but there was iron under it. He's not after one parcel. He's after the whole valley's water. One weak hand at a time. The widow, the Indian, folks, the law was never built to protect in the first place. He looked at Gideon. He picks the ones nobody'll stand for. That's the whole trick of it. Nell set down her fork. Why nobody? Because standing up costs, Josiah said. Costs friends, costs trade, costs the easy good opinion of folks you have to live beside. Most men, they'll notice a wrong. They'll cluck about it. But noticing and doing, he shook his head, those are two different counties. Ma'am, and most folks never make the trip. The lamp burned. Outside an owl called once, twice, and quit. It was then that Gideon spoke. And when he did, it landed heavier for all the silence he'd kept. My grandfather came west with nothing, he said. He wasn't looking at any of them. He was looking at the dark window, the way a man looks at the past. Squatted ground nobody wanted till it was worth wanting. Then men with money and lawyers came to take it, and they near did. And the only reason they didn't was a circuit judge who couldn't be bought. He turned then, looked at Nell. I grew up on that story. Land can be bought, he used to say. The right to live decent on your own land that's not for sale, the day we let it be for sale. We're all just waiting our turn to be the one they buy out. He sat with that a moment. I forgot it, he said, lower. For a long while I let myself forget it. Easier to forget a thing than to live up to it. He looked at his own scarred hands. I don't aim to forget it. sitting at the same table where a boy's about to lose his father's last gift to him. So he met Josiah's eye. What do we do? Josiah almost smiled. Almost. Well, now, he said, that's the first right question anybody's asked all day. There was a thing Nell remembered later. In the night, after the boy was asleep, she'd been turning over the water rights. The filing, the way Dunmore claimed the creek began on his range. And a memory came up from a year and more ago. Her husband, Caleb, the last leave he'd had before they sent him out. He'd sat at their kitchen table, their own table. In the house, the bank had since taken with papers spread out and a worried line between his brows. She'd asked him what it was. Just seeing to things, he'd said, in case. And then a strange thing. He'd taken her hand and said, if it ever comes to water. Nell, you remember, I saw to the water. There's papers. I put it where it can't be undone. She hadn't thought of it since. Grief had washed a year of small things clean out of her. But it came back now, sharp in the dark. I put it where it can't be undone. She sat up in the narrow bunkhouse bed. Toby slept on. Steady. What papers? Put where? She'd torn through everything she owned a dozen times since the foreclosure. There'd been no papers. The bank's men had been through the house. Dunmore's filing said the water was his to take. But Caleb had been a careful man. A quiet, careful man who said little and meant all of it. Where it can't be undone. She didn't know where. Not yet. But she lay back down with her heart going hard. Because for the first time since the rider came up the track that morning, she had the smallest thing she'd been missing. She had a thread to pull. She thought fierce, certain. The way you think a thing in the dark, when nobody can argue you, out of it, I will pull it. I will pull it till the whole thing unravels in that smiling man's hands. Across the yard, a single window in the big house still showed lamplight. Gideon Hart wasn't sleeping either. The rain came 3 days later, and it came hard. Not the soft fall rain that the ground drinks glad. This was the other kind, the kind that comes sideways, that hammers the roof and turns the yard to running mud, that makes the horses stamp and roll their eyes in the dark of the barn. Came in, off the north, with a cold edge on it, the first real teeth of the season, and it shut the ranch down to waiting. Nell got Toby settled in the bunkhouse with a lamp and his slate. Then she ran across the yard with a sack over her head to see to the chicken. And on her way back, she saw the big house door standing open and Gideon out on the porch. He stood at the rail with the rain coming down 2 feet in front of him, and he was staring out into it like it was showing him something. His knuckles were white on the wood. She knew that look. She'd worn it herself. She came up onto the porch. Out of the wet, Mr. Hart. He didn't turn. For a moment she thought he hadn't heard, the way Toby wouldn't have. But then he spoke, and his voice came from somewhere far back. It sounds like that night, he said. The wind. It came down out of the north just like this. She didn't say anything. She learned from her boy the worth of waiting. Some things a person has to say in their own time, and rushing them is how you lose them. Years, Gideon said. Folks think I don't talk about it because it hurts too much. A short sound, not a laugh. It's the opposite. I don't talk about it because of what I'd have to say if I started telling it true. The rain hammered down. The lamp inside threw a long gold rectangle out onto the porch board. Tell it true, then, Nell said. Quiet. I'm not the town. I won't carry it anywhere. He was silent. So long, she thought. That was the end of it. Then he started. Ruth was her name. We had 4 years. Good one. Voice found a steadier track. The track of a story, long rehearsed in the dark, and never once spoken aloud. She was carrying our first. Near her time. Fever came on her sudden, the way it does, and the snow came on the same night. Like the two of them had planned it. He gripped the rail. No doctor for 30 miles, and the road already going under. So I rode. I left her with Josiah's wife, God rest her, and I rode to fetch help door to door. Anybody with a wagon, a fast horse, anybody who'd ride for the doctor, while I rode back to Ruth. Nell stood very still. Some doors opened, Gideon said. Some didn't. It was a bad night to ask a man to go out in. I understood that. I told myself I understood. His jaw worked. And then I came to Dunmore. The name dropped into the rain, like a stone, into a well. He had the fast, still does. Whole barn of them, warm and men enough. I beat on that door near, turned his scarred hand over. He opened it, stood there in the warm, and he looked at me, and he looked out at the snow, and Gideon made him not on a night. I've got stock to think of. A man's first duties to his own. And Nell's, I rode empty. Him already gone out to another. Rode home through it with nothing. And by the time it just went very flat, which was worse. She was gone, both of them. Fever or the cold, gone. Time in the took me to ride the valley and get told no. The rain, the lamp, two of them on the porch with the dark all around. Truth of it, Gideon said. Heartless. Heart. Got it. Exactly backwards. And I never once, you know why, Nell said softly. And here he turned and looked at her. And what was in his face wasn't grief. It was something he'd been hiding under the grief for 7 years. And it was uglier and more honest. And naming it cost him everything. Because I'd rather they thought me cold than know the truth, he said. Which is that I have hated that man every hour of every day for 7 years. That I've laid awake, building his death in my head 100 ways. That the cold they see on me, his voice dropped. It's not cold, it's a lid. It's the lid I keep on so the hate doesn't get out and burn down everything I've got left. I told myself I was grieving. I wasn't grieving, Nell. I was guarding the fire. She didn't speak right off. A lesser comfort would have been an insult to what he'd just handed her. When she did speak, she spoke careful, the way you'd speak picking your footing across a creek on wet rocks. My Caleb died in a fort I never saw, she said. Fever. Same as your Ruth. Not even a battle. In a far-off place with strangers. And for a long while, I was angry at him. Can you feature that? Angry at a dead man for dying. For leaving me and the boy. For being so far off, I couldn't even. She stopped. Steadied. Anger's easy. That's the secret of it. Nobody tells you. Anger's easy because it points somewhere. Grief just sits in your chest with nowhere to go. So we trade the grief for the anger. Because anger at least feels like doing something. He was listening, truly listening, in a way she guessed he hadn't let himself in years. But here's the thing I learned, she went on, and it took me near a year and a kind old woman to learn it. Grief isn't a house you live in forever. It's a room you carry with you. You don't have to tear it down. You don't have to pretend it's not there. She lifted one hand. Open, you carry it. And carrying it doesn't mean you can't walk into other rooms. It doesn't mean you can't sit at a table or hear a boy laugh. Or she let it hang a half-beat stand on a porch in the rain and finally say the true thing out loud to somebody. The rain was easing. You could hear it gentling on the roof. You've been keeping that lid on alone for 7 years, Nell said. It's no wonder folks think you cold. A man can't hold a fire down that long and have any warmth left over to show. But Mr. Hart and her voice softened, all the way you took in A Widow and a Deaf Boy off the side of the road. You're learning my son's words with your hands. At night by the lamp. Don't think I haven't seen the light. That's not a man with no warmth left. That's a man who's been rationing it, like it was the last he had. Gideon turned away from her, to the rail, to the rain. She saw his shoulders. She saw what it cost him to be seen that plain. I don't know how to put the fire down, he said, rough. After this long, I wouldn't know how to be anything but what I've been. You don't put it down all at once, Nell said. You bank it, like a stove for the night. You don't let it go out, and you don't let it rage. You bank it down to coals, and you let it warm the house instead of burning it. She came and stood beside him at the rail. Not touching, just there. And you let people stand next to it. That's the part you've been missing. You've kept everybody back from the fire so it wouldn't catch them. But Mr. Heartfire kept all to yourself. Just burns the one who's holding it. They stood there. The storm walked off east, and the clouds tore and let through a little ragged moon. And there came a moment she felt it. And so did he, where the small space between them got smaller, where his hand on the rail was near enough to hers that the warmth of it carried, where, if either one of them turned, just turned, the 7 years and the 1 year, and all the careful distance might fold up into something. Neither had let themselves want. He turned. She turned. And then, from across the yard, the bunkhouse door creaked, and a small figure stood in the lamplight with a quilt around his shoulders. Toby, woken by the quiet after the storm, come looking for his mother. The moment let go of them, soft, like a held breath released. Nell stepped back. I'd best see to him. Yeah, Gideon said. She went down the steps into the wet yard. At the bottom, she stopped and looked back up at him, standing in the gold light of the open door. That fire you've been guarding, she said. I don't think it's just hate in there. I think that's the part that scares you. I think there's other things banked down with it. Older thing, better one, a faint smile. Good night, Mr. Hart. She crossed to her boy and gathered him in and took him back to bed. Gideon stood on the porch a long while after, in the cold, with the door open behind him, throwing its warmth out into the dark. For 7 years, he'd kept that door shut. He left it open now, watching the bunkhouse lamp until it dimmed. And he thought about coals and rooms a man could carry, and the strange, terrible mercy of being seen all the way to the bottom and not turned from. He didn't have a word for what he felt. He'd lost the habit of those words. But it was closer to warm than he'd been in a long, long time. The thread Nell pulled led her, in the end, to a Bible. Not her own. Caleb's, the big family Bible his mother had given them at the wedding. The one thing the bank's men had left because it had no resale worth to anybody but God. It had ridden out of the foreclosed house in the bottom of her crate, under the quilt. And it had sat in the bunkhouse this whole while, and she'd never once opened it. Because opening it meant his handwriting in the front, and she hadn't been strong enough. She was strong enough now. She opened it at the kitchen table one gray morning while Toby fed the horses and Gideon mended fence. And there, tucked deep in the pages of Deuteronomy, where no thief would ever think to look, was a folded oilcloth packet. Inside, papers, water rights, filed and stamped and sealed, recorded with the territorial office in Helena. Caleb Calloway's claim to the creek that crossed his land, dated 4 years back. Witnessed and notarized. Every line of it legal and clean. I put it where it can't be undone. Her hands shook. Not from fear. From something else. Dunmore had filed upstream and claimed the creek began on his range. But Caleb had filed first. Years first. The water that crossed the Calloway land was claimed in law. In writing. In a record sitting in Helena, that no county, judge, and no cattle baron's money could quietly disappear. She sat there a long moment with her dead husband's careful hand under her fingers. You saw to it, she thought. You said you would, and you did. You knew what was coming, and you built a wall around your boy, same as I'd have done. We never did get to talk it through. You built it, and here it is when we need it most. She wiped her eyes. Then she got up and went to find Gideon. Because a wall is a fine thing, but a wall alone won't stand if there's nobody willing to defend it. They gathered that evening. It was the first time Hart's Crossing had held a gathering in 7 years. Josiah, of course, and Nell and Gideon. But Gideon had ridden out that afternoon and come back with others. And that was the surprise of it. He'd brought Doc Whitman, the old physician who'd been the one to ride out too late that storm night and had carried his own quiet guilt over it ever since. He'd brought Reverend Bellwether, a lean, tired man whose sermons nobody much heeded, but who had never once, in 20 years, told a soul they weren't welcome in his church, a fact that had cost him half his congregation over the years, and that he'd never apologized for. and he'd brought Walks in Two Worlds. She came with her grown son, the two of them careful and watchful, in the way of people who have learned that a white man's invitation can be a trap as easily as a kindness. She was older than Nell had pictured, straight-backed, with eyes that took the measure of the room before she'd crossed the threshold. Gideon met her at the door, and he did a thing Nell hadn't expected. He didn't usher her in like a guest doing him a favor by coming. He stepped back, and he said, "Plain, you've more right to be made welcome in this valley than I do. Your people were here first. I should have come to you years ago. I didn't, and that's on me. I'm asking you to sit at my table now. Late is worse than early, but late is better than never." Walks in Two Worlds looked at him a long moment. Then she came in. They talked it through. The filing, the water, the Crow family's creeping fences, and wandering cattle and unreadable paper. The widow's parcel, the pattern of it, laid out by Josiah. Plain as a map, one man, taking the valley's water one weak hand at a time, picking always the folks the law had been built to look past. He's not breaking the law, Doc said heavily. That's the devil of it. He's using it. He's got the land office and likely a judge, and everything moves slow and legal till one day you wake up and it's done, and there's a stamp on it says it was always so. There's the water rights now, Nell said. And she laid Caleb's papers on the table, filed years before Dunmore, and it's not his to undo. The law's on our side this once. The law's a thing that has to be made to work, Josiah said. It doesn't run on its own. It runs on people willing to stand up in front of it and say, "This is wrong, and I'll testify it's wrong, and I'll keep saying so when it costs me." That's the whole machine. Take away the standing up, and the law's just words on a page Dunmore can paper his walls with. The room was quiet. Reverend, who said the thing that turned it. "I've watched this valley for 20 years, Bellwether said. He spoke soft the way he did, so you had to lean in. "I've watched good people see a wrong done to a neighbor and tell themselves it wasn't their affair. The widow, not my affair. The Indian family, not my affair. Deaf child, the school, turned out not my affair." He shook his head. "And every time a person says, 'not my affair,' the wall around the weak gets one stone lower. Day, it's their affair. And they look around for who'll stand with them and find they're alone, because they taught the whole town, own example, that standing alone is what a body's supposed to do." He looked around the table, at the widow, Crow woman and her son, at the black foreman, watching every face. "I'll tell you what I believe," Bellwether said, "and I've believed it long enough to lose half my flock over it. So you can trust I mean it. Before God, there is no pew for the white man, and a back row for everyone else. There is no full person and half person. There's just people, every one of them made by the same hand, and the only sermon that ever mattered is how we treat the ones the world says don't count. That's it. That's the whole of the book, far as I've ever been able to tell. The rest is just footnotes." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Walks in Two Worlds did. Her English was careful, exact. "Words are easy," she said. "Your people have given mine a great many words." She looked at Gideon, but this one came to my door first, stepped back and named his own debt before I'd said a thing. She nodded, slow. "So I will stand, not for the word, for the man who knocked, instead of breaking the door." And Gideon, who could not abide being thanked, who flinched from any light, turned on his own goodness, looked down at the table and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't spoil it. They agreed it there. They'd take Dunmore to law, all of them together, the water rights at the center, and the pattern of his pushing all around it. They'd stand up in the open and make the machine work. Sunday, Gideon went to church. He hadn't set foot inside in 7 years. The whole town knew it. So when the door opened during the first hymn, and Gideon Hart walked in, the singing didn't stop, but it thinned, voices trailing off as heads turned. He didn't come alone. Josiah came at his shoulder, and behind them, Nell with Toby's hand in hers. And behind them, last and unmistakable, Walks in Two Worlds and her son, in a church that had never once in its history seated a Crow family in its pews. The room went stiff. You could feel it. Careful white town faced of a sudden with everyone it had spent years deciding didn't quite belong. Walking up the center aisle together, a man near the front stood up, heavyset, red in the face. "Now see here, Reverend." "It is," Bellwether said from the pulpit, mild, unmovable. "A house of God means it was never mine to keep anybody out of, nor yours. Sit down, Harold, or don't. But these folks are staying, and we'll have the next verse now." For a moment it hung. The red-faced man looked around for the town to back him, and the town, for once, didn't. Maybe it was the Reverend's flat certainty. Maybe it was Gideon Hart's still and dangerous quiet. Maybe, and Nell liked to believe, this was some of it, maybe a few of them, just a few, had been waiting a long time for somebody to go first, so they wouldn't have to be the one. The man sat down, and Gideon Hart, with a widow and a deaf boy, and a black soldier and a Crow family, took a pew, and they sang the next verse, rough and uneven, and it was, Nell thought, about the truest music she'd ever heard in a church, for being so badly sung by people who'd just been made, against their habit, to do one right thing. She looked down at Toby. He couldn't hear the hymn, but he was watching the faces, the mouths moving, the strange tide of the room, and he signed up at her, small, just for her. "Everyone is here." "Yes," she signed back. "Everyone." She didn't sleep easy that night, though, because she'd lived long enough to know that the world doesn't take a defeat lying down. She was right. That night, 4 miles off, in the dark, men rode up the creek to the place where the water gathered behind the old earthen dam on the Callaway land, and they went to work with picks and powder. The water was gone by morning. Nell knew it the moment she stepped out of the bunkhouse, before she'd even seen the creek. You can feel water in a place. Green smell, missing. The yard smelled of dry dust and something burnt. He ran. Toby ran behind her, not knowing why yet, only that his mother was running. The dam was breached, not weakened, destroyed. Great ragged gap blown through the earthen wall, and below it the gathered pond drained away to a trickle. Precious water that fed the lower pasture and the stock tanks, and the whole of the Callaway parcel's worth gone into the ground and run off downhill, where it did nobody any good. Gideon and Josiah came at a run from the big house. They stood at the breach and looked at it, and Josiah crouched and picked up something from the mud and held it up. Fuse cord still on it. "Wasn't no accident," he said low. "No," Gideon said. Nell stood looking at the ruin of it, with her heart going to stone. She'd found Caleb's papers. She'd thought the law would hold. And here was Dunmore's answer to the law. "I'll just take the water by force, and let your papers say whatever they like about a creek that's run dry. He can't use it," she said, and she heard her own voice crack. "If he can't have it, he'll just destroy it. So nobody has it. So I've got papers for a creek with no water in it." The despair came up in her like cold flood. What good's a right to water that's not there? What good's any of it? Gideon looked at her. He didn't have a comfort. He was not a man of comforts. But Toby tugged her sleeve. She didn't turn at first. She was too sunk in it. He tugged harder. Then he got in front of her, between her and the broken dam, and he made her look at him, the way she'd taught him to do when a thing was important. Get in front. Make them see you. And his hands started to move. Fast. Faster than she'd ever seen him sign. So fast she had to catch his wrists and slow him. "Slow down. Tell me," he told her. He'd seen it. That was the long and short of it. And it came out of him in a flood once she'd slowed him to where she could read it. He hadn't been able to sleep. The quiet after the storm week sometimes kept him up. He'd told her before, a deaf child sleeps by the feel of the house, and a too-still house can wake him same as a noise wakes a hearing child. So he'd been at the bunkhouse window in the dark, and he'd seen riders, 3 of them, coming up along the creek with no lanterns, which a man only does when he doesn't want to be seen. He'd watched them at the dam. He couldn't hear the picks or the blast, but he'd felt. It felt the ground jump through the floor under his feet. He signed, his hand flat, and then flinching up to show the jolt. He'd seen the flash. He'd seen the water start to go, and he'd seen their faces. Close enough when one rider passed near the bunkhouse on the way out, lit for a moment by the ragged moon. One had a mark Toby signed. He drew it on his own face, with a finger a line down the left cheek, from eye to jaw. Here, a scar, long. Then he held up a hand. Fingers spread, and folded the smallest one down. And this, gone. The little finger, gone on the right hand. Nell went very still. "Mr. Hart," she said. "Josiah, come here. You need to see this." She had Toby tell it again, signing. As she spoke it aloud for the men, 3 riders. Blast he'd felt through the floor. The scarred face, the missing finger. Josiah and Gideon traded a look over the boy's head. And it was a charged look, because they both knew that face. "Lemuel boy," Josiah said quietly. "Scar and a shorthand both. Dunmore's man does his rough work." He looked at the boy with something like awe coming up under his caution. The child saw Dunmore's own hired hand blow that dam. Saw him plain enough to name him. "He didn't see him," Nell said. "He can't hear a thing. The court'll say. A deaf boy in the dark couldn't have. He saw him better than a hearing man would have," Gideon said, and there was a new thing in his voice. Hard and certain. A hearing man in that bunkhouse. He'd have heard the blast and run to the window after. He'd have caught the tail of it. Toby was already watching. He lives by his eyes. He had that man's face a full minute, while the rest of the world would have still been rubbing sleep out of their ears. He crouched down to the boy's level, the way he'd learned to. He's not a weaker witness than a hearing child. He's a better one. He put his hand flat on his own heart, the sign Toby had first taught him. Good then. Slow, working at it. He made another. He pointed at his own eyes, then at Toby. Then he tapped his own temple. "You see, you keep." Toby looked at him. And then the boy did something he had never done with Gideon before. He stepped in and put his arms around the big man's neck, brief and fierce, the way a child does when somebody has finally understood the thing he's been trying his whole short life to make people understand. Gideon held still under it like a man holding still under a benediction he didn't feel he'd earned. They sat down that afternoon, all of them, and Gideon said the thing out loud that needed saying. "They've been telling this boy his whole life that he's got no voice." He looked around the table. School turned him out. Town calls him names I won't repeat at a table. And kind folks talk over his head like he's furniture, because he can't talk back the way they're used to. His jaw set. They were wrong, every one of them. He's always had a voice. There was never a single thing wrong with his voice. He looked at Toby, who was watching his mouth move and his mother's hands fly to keep up. The fault was never in the boy's hearing. It was in everybody else's. Nobody had bothered to learn how to listen. "It won't be simple," Doc warned. "A court, through an interpreter, his own mother, no less, who's a party to the suit. Dunmore's lawyers will say she's putting words in his hands. They'll say a deaf child can't be sworn, can't be trusted, didn't understand what he saw. Then we'll teach them otherwise," Gideon said. "We'll get him an interpreter the court can't call biased. We'll show them how he tells a thing same words, every time, with detail no coached child could hold. We'll make the room learn how to hear him." He stood. "That's the whole fight. When you boil it down, not the water. The water's just the ground it's happening on. The fight is whether a widow and a Crow family and a deaf boy count for as much in front of the law as a rich man with a smile." And I'll tell you, his voice dropped. "Even certain they do. They always did. The law just keeps forgetting it. And somebody's got to keep walking in and reminding it." Nell looked at this man, this heartless man, the town's name for him standing in his own kitchen. Having torn the lid off his guarded fire, and turned the heat of 7 years toward the protecting of her son. And she understood, all at once, and with no fear in it, that somewhere in these weeks they had stopped being a widow and a rancher who'd struck a bargain for a season's work. They had become, without ever saying the word. Toby felt it, too. He climbed down from his chair and went and stood between the two of them. And he took his mother's hand in his right. And, after a moment's deciding, Gideon's hand in his left. The three of them stood there in the lamplight, joined by the boy in the middle. Nobody said anything. There wasn't a word big enough that wouldn't have made it smaller. Creek ran dry where Dunmore's powder had opened. Caleb had left, and the wall, Margaret of memory, no, Nell corrected herself. Caleb had built, and the boy who'd seen in the dark what no one thought a deaf child could see, broken man learning to bank his fire and let people stand beside it. All of it was gathering now, drawing toward the one room where it would have to be settled, the courthouse, where the smiling man kept his judges. They were coming for him now, all of them. And a man who has spent his life picking only the weak to prey on has no idea, none at all, what to do when the weak stop standing alone. Word of what they meant to do got around the way everything got around in Calder Bluff fast and crooked, and in Dunmore's ear before it was rightly in anyone else's. His answer came in pieces, the way a careful man's answers do. The first piece came to Josiah. He'd gone in for supplies, same as always. And the man at the feed store who'd sold to him for 9 years wouldn't meet his eye, wouldn't fill the order. Out of stock, he said, to a barn full of stock. And when Josiah pressed him, quiet, the man dropped his voice and said the truth of it. Dunmore's past word. Anybody trades with Heart's Crossing, or testifies for that widow, they'll find Dunmore's done trading with them. And he buys from half this town, Josiah. Half this town can't afford to cross him. A pause, shame. I'm sorry. I got mouths to feed. Josiah took it the way he took most things. Still, he'd had a lifetime of doors not opening. One more was just one more. But the second piece was worse. And it was meant to be. It came as a rumor, set loose careful, that the whole case was a fraud, that the widow had no real water rights, that the papers were forged. Cooked up by Hart, who everyone knew had hated Dunmore for years over some old grudge. And the witness, a deaf child, a child who couldn't hear, couldn't speak, couldn't be trusted to know night, from day coached by his mother, to point at an innocent man. You going to hang Royce Dunmore on the say-so of a dummy and a black man and a squaw? That was how the rumor went. In those words. The ugly words. Set loose in the saloons to do their ugly work. Nell heard it from Doc, who'd heard it making the round. Very still while he told it. He's not fighting the case, she said when Doc finished. He can't fight the case. Papers are real. And he knows it. So he's fighting us, the people. He's telling the whole town that my boy doesn't count, that Josiah doesn't count, that a woman doesn't count. Truth coming out of your mouth or your hands isn't worth the air it takes. That's about the size of it, Doc said heavily. Nell said, not just the water. It nearly went another way first. Gideon heard about the feed store. He heard about the rumor, the words used, dummy, and the rest. And the lid he'd kept on for 7 years. The lid Nell had coaxed him to lift just a careful inch. It rattled hard on its hinges. He saddled the sorrel at dusk. He didn't say where he was going. He didn't have to. Josiah read it off in plain, the way you read a storm off a sky. Josiah got to the barn before him. Don't, Josiah said. He called that boy a dummy in a public house. Gideon's voice was low and terrible. He's telling the town a child doesn't count as human. I'm going to go explain to him personal how wrong he is. With your fists, if that's what it takes. Josiah stepped into the doorway, filled it. He didn't touch the rein. He just stood where the horse would have to go through him. Listen to me, he said, because I have been where you're standing, more times than you've got years, and I'm going to tell you the thing nobody told me. He held Gideon's eye right over there and beat that man bloody. You will feel righteous for about as long as it takes to ride home, and then you'll have proved him right. Proved, that's how the wrong kind of people settle things. With fists in the dark, like animals, just exactly what he's been telling the town you are. You'll have handed him the story he wants and tied it up with a ribbon. Gideon said nothing. His jaw worked. I've spent my whole life being told my word's worth less than a white man's, Josiah went on, and his voice never rose, which made it land all the harder. And the times I wanted to answer it with my hands, Lord. There were times, every single one, the answer would have cost me more than the insult did, because the world's already decided what a man like me is. The only thing that ever changed a mind, the only thing, was being so plainly in the right, so calm and so plainly in the right, that they couldn't make me into the thing they wanted me to be. He leaned in. You want to fight him for that, boy? Fine. Fight him where it'll stick. In the open. In the daylight. With the truth. Beat him in front of the whole town in a way they can't unsee. That's a wound that doesn't heal. A black eye heals in a week and makes him the victim besides. The barn was quiet. The sorrel stamped once. Put the heat to work, Josiah said. Gentler now. Don't let it burn you up. You've been burning yourself up for 7 years. I'd hate to watch you finish the job over a thing we can win clean. Gideon stood there a long moment. Then he took the saddle off the sorrel and hung it on the rail. All right, he said, rough. All right, the daylight. The daylight, Josiah agreed, and Gideon understood, standing there. That this, too, was a kind of strength he'd never had, the strength it takes not to swing. That the lid he'd hated all these years, the holding back, the bank on the fire, it wasn't only weakness and fear. Used right, turned right. It was the very thing that would save them. A man who could hold a fire 7 years could surely hold it 3 more weeks, and then let it out where it would do some good. The last piece of Dunmore's answer, though that one came to them. 2 days before the hearing, a man rode up the track at dusk, alone, hatless, looking back over his shoulder the whole way. It was Hollis, the land agent, Dunmore's own paper pusher, the man who'd filed the upstream claim and stamped the lie that the creek began on Dunmore Range. He half fell off his horse in the yard. Gideon and Josiah came out. Nell stayed in the doorway with Toby behind her. I'll testify, Hollis said. The words came out of him in a rush, like he'd been holding them under pressure. I'll testify to all of it. The false filing. The judge he's got in his pocket, Pruitt, the circuit judge. Dunmore's bought him 3 times over. The Crow land, the forged marks on papers, those folks couldn't read. He was shaking. I did it. I filed the paper. God help me. I did what he paid me to do and told myself it was just paper, just lines. No harm in lines. He looked up at them. Wretched. Blowing that damn Lemuel Boyd and that powder. That wasn't paper. That was if that water'd come down on somebody. He couldn't finish. Why? Gideon said. Not unkind. Direct. Why now? Hollis was quiet a moment. Boy, he said finally. I heard what Dunmore's saying about the deaf child. Doesn't count. Doesn't count as a person. He wiped his face. I got a sister back east. Born like that. Couldn't hear. Smartest soul I ever knew. And the world treated her like she was nothing her whole life. And I let them. I was a boy. I let them. Because it was easier. His voice broke. I'm done letting them. I'll stand up, whatever it costs me. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Nell came down off the step. She put her hand on the man's shaking arm. It costs everything sometimes to stand up late, she said. But late is better than never. My boy would tell you the same, if you'd learn how to hear him. And Hollis the crooked man, the bought man, the man who'd spent his whole life looking away, put his face in his hands and wept in the yard of Heart's Crossing because somebody had finally given him the chance to stop. The courthouse hadn't held a crowd like it since the railroad came through. They came from all over the county, ranchers and shopkeepers, the curious and the ashamed, the feed store man who wouldn't sell to Josiah, sitting near the back with his hat in his hand. Miss Pruitt, the schoolteacher, 3 rows up, who'd turned a deaf boy out of her classroom and had come, it seemed, to watch what became of him. The whole town, more or less, packed onto the hard benches to see whether Royce Dunmore could be touched, because that was the real question, not the water. Everybody understood that by now. The question was whether a man that big, that smiling, that woven into the county's money, whether such a man could be made to answer to the same law as anybody else. Dunmore sat up front easy. Like a man at church he half owned. His lawyers flanked him, city men in good coats, and on the bench sat Judge Pruitt, the circuit judge the one Hollis had named, the one in Dunmore's pocket. That was the first trouble, and Gideon's lawyer rose to meet it before the gavel had hardly fallen. He was a young man named Aldast Crane, brought in from 2 counties over precisely because he owed Dunmore nothing. And he stood and said, plain and loud, Your Honor, before we begin, the petitioners move that you recuse yourself from this matter on grounds of documented financial relationship with the defendant relationship to which we have a sworn witness, prepared to testify here today in open court before all these people. The room rustled. Pruitt's face did something, a flicker. He looked at Dunmore. Dunmore's easy smile didn't move, but something behind it did. And here was the thing Dunmore hadn't counted on, a packed room. He'd built his whole life in the quiet, in back offices, and after dark filings, and words slipped into the right ear. He'd never once had to do his work with 200 neighbors watching. A judge can take a bribe in the dark, recusing himself in front of the entire county. With a sworn witness standing ready to name the payments, that was a different thing. That was a noose, and Pruitt could feel it. In the interest, Pruitt said slowly, of the appearance of fairness, I'll step down. Judge Holland from the Territorial Circuit is in the building. He can sit. It was the first stone out of the wall, the crowd murmured. And Nell, watching, understood Josiah's lesson made flesh. The daylight. In the dark. Dunmore won every time. Dragged into the light. In front of everyone. His whole machine seized up. Judge Holland was a spare. Dry man with no stake in Calder Bluff and no patience for show. Heard the matter summarized. And got down to it. The water rights came first. Crane laid Caleb Calloway's filing on the bench dated. Sealed. Recorded in Helena 4 years gone. Years before Dunmore's claim. Dunmore's lawyers fought it. Forged, they said. Convenient, they said. So Crane sent a man he'd thought ahead with the matching record copied straight from the territorial office. Certified under the territorial seal. Beyond any county's reach to fake or vanish. 2 papers, the widow's and Helena's, matching line for line. Holland examined them a long while. These are in order, he said. The senior claim is the widow's. That's not a close question. Mr. Dunmore's downstream filing cannot override a recorded claim that predates it by 4 years. As to the water, the law is plain. It should have ended there. But Crane wasn't done, because the water was never the whole of it, Your Honor. The senior claim establishes the right, but the right was answered with powder. The petitioner's dam was deliberately destroyed 11 nights ago. We have a witness to that destruction, an eyewitness who saw the men, and can name one of them. Bring him, Holland said, and Nell stood, and took her son by the hand, and walked him to the front of that crowded watching room. Dunmore's lawyer was on his feet at once. Your Honor, this is the deaf child. He cannot hear the oath. He cannot speak. Any testimony comes filtered through his mother, a party, to this suit. It's worthless. Worse than worthless. It's words put in a child's hands by a woman who wants the verdict. It was the moment they'd known would come. Crane had prepared for the petitioners anticipated this objection. Crane said. Toby Calloway will not be interpreted by his mother. The court has engaged Mr. Ferris, instructor at the Territorial School for the Deaf, who arrived yesterday, who has no connection to any party, and whose qualifications I'll enter into the record. A neat older man rose from the front row. The objection died in the lawyer's throat, but it was Holland who turned the room. He looked down at the boy, small, straight-backed, in a clean shirt, his eyes going steady from face to face the way they always did. I've sat the bench 20 years, Holland said to the room. As much as the boy. I've had witnesses who could hear every word and speak any language I please and lie through the whole of it. And I've learned the truth doesn't come out of a man's ears. It comes out of whether he saw a thing and tells it straight. He looked at Ferris. Ask the boy what he saw, exact as he can give it. I'll weigh it like I'd weigh any man. And so they asked him, Toby told it. Hands sure and unhurried. The way he'd told it the first morning at the dam, and every time since. And that was the thing that landed, because they had him tell it twice. And twice it came out the same, to the smallest detail, the way no coached child could ever manage. 3 rider, no lantern. The jolt through the ground he felt through his feet. The flash, the water going. And the man who passed near, lit by the moon. The scar down the left cheek, with the smallest finger gone. Ferris spoke it into the silent room, plain and careful. And when he said, a scar down the left cheek, and the smallest finger gone from the right hand, every soul in that courtroom who knew Calder Bluff turned. All at once, the same direction toward the side bench where Dunmore's hired men sat, toward Lemuel Boyd, shorthand both. Boyd went white. He half rose, and in rising in that one panicked motion, for any lawyer could stop him, he gave himself away to 200 witnesses surer than any words could have. Came apart fast for Dunmore after that, the way these things do once the first stone goes. Hollis testified. The false filing, bought judge, forged marks on papers shoved at a Crow family who'd been counted on not to read them. All of it. Wretched and steady. And when Dunmore's lawyer tried to paint him a disgruntled liar, Hollis just said, I filed the papers myself. My hands on everyone. If I'm lying now, I was lying then. And either way, you ought to throw out every claim ever stamped for that man, which was exactly what the judge proceeded to do. And then Gideon was called to speak to the pattern of it. The widow, the Crow family, the deaf boy, the choosing, always of the ones the world looked past. Holland asked him a plain question. Mr. Hart, you've no legal stake in the Calloway water. Why are you standing here at all? Gideon was not a man for speeches. He stood with his hat in his hands, and he found the words slow. Folks call me Heartless, he said. I let them. Easier than the truth. He looked, just once, at Dunmore. 7 years ago, I went to a man's door in a blizzard with my wife, dying, and asked him to send a fast horse for the doctor. And he looked at me, and he looked at the snow, and he said his first duty was to his own stock, and he shut the door. My wife died that night. So did our child. The room had gone dead still. I spent 7 years thinking the cold I felt was grief. Gideon said, it wasn't, and it was shame. And I kept it shut up tight so it wouldn't burn down what little I had left. And in all that time, I never once stood up for another soul. Because I'd told myself caring was a thing that only got people killed. He drew a breath. Then I heard a woman crying behind a depot. And a boy looked at me who the whole world had decided didn't count. And I found out the cold hadn't taken everything after all. He set his jaw. Heartless is when you watch somebody go under, and you shut the door because their trouble's not your own. I did the other thing. Once I stopped, and once was enough to know the door doesn't have to stay shut. That's why I'm standing here, because I shut it once before. And a man can't get that back, but he can, by God, make sure he never does it again. Nobody moved, and the man whose door it had been sat in the front row with his easy smile finally wholly gone. Judge Holland ruled before the afternoon was out. The water rights upheld in Nell's name. Dunmore's filings voided. The matter of the dam and the bribery and the forged Crow papers referred up to the territorial authorities for criminal prosecution, past the reach of any county judge Dunmore could buy. Lemuel Boyd taken into custody before he reached the door. Dunmore himself. Holland looked at him a long, cold moment. Mr. Dunmore, you'll answer these charges before the territorial court. I'd advise you not to travel. He traveled anyway. He was gone by morning, on the first stage north, the way such men go. Whether they'd catch him was a question for other men in other counties. But the wall he'd spent years building, one weak hand at a time, had come down in a single afternoon in the daylight, in front of everyone, where he'd never once had to stand. The water came back in 3 days. Josiah and Gideon and the Crow woman's son rebuilt the dam, and the gathered creek filled the pond. And the morning Nell heard it running again. She stood at the bunkhouse door and just listened to the green, wet sound of it, back where it belonged. Toby came and stood beside her. He couldn't hear it, but he could see it, the shine of the water moving, and he could feel the damp coming back into the air. He looked up at his mother and signed. It came home. It did, she signed. We all did. The town changed after the hearing, not all at once. Towns don't, but it changed in pieces. The way the trouble had come in pieces, only the other direction. Miss Pruitt came out to Hart's Crossing one Saturday, nervous, twisting her gloves. She'd been thinking, she said, about the boy, about what she'd said not fair to the other children, and how wrong it sat with her now. She'd written away, she said, to the territorial school for the books, the way of teaching the sign. I'd like to learn it, she said, and teach it. Any child that comes after him. You'd let him come back. Nell looked at her a long moment. People don't change easy, and when they do, a body ought to make room for it. Or what was the point of asking them to? He'll come back, Nell said, and Miss Pruitt, thank you. It's no small thing to learn how to hear somebody. Most folks never trouble. The feed store sold to Josiah again. Didn't say much about it. Just filled the order. Full measure. And once added a sack of peppermints for the boy and looked away while he did it, which was as close to I'm sorry as a proud man gets. And Reverend Bellwether, who'd lost half his flock over the years for keeping his door open to everyone, Bellwether found his church fuller, of a sudden, than it had been in 20 years. Whether that was conscience or curiosity, he didn't ask. A full pew's a full pew, he told Gideon. Dry, the Lord can sort their reasons. Not everyone came around. Some never would. The red-faced man from the church kept to his side of the street and his hard opinions. And that was the way of things. You don't win everyone. You just make it harder after for the world to look away. Because once a thing's been seen plain in the daylight, it can't go all the way back to being unseen. Gideon made his offer on the porch. In the evening, the way most true things in that house got said. It wasn't a speech. He wasn't built for speeches, and he'd used up a year's worth at the hearing. This place is too big for one man, he said, looking out at the paddock where the gentle old mare he'd given. The boy stood switching her tail in the gold light. Been too big for 7 years. I told myself I liked it empty. He turned the brim of his hat in his hands. I don't. I never did. I just didn't have anything to fill it with that I wasn't scared of losing. Nell waited. She'd learned to wait with him. I'm not asking you a fancy question, he said. I don't have the words for fancy. I'm just telling you my intention, which is to stay. To make this your home, and the boy's home. For keeps, papers and preacher and all, if you'll have it. And if you won't, he made himself say it, then you and Toby keep your place with the water, that's yours. And I'll be glad of it anyhow, because it's right. The intention stands either way. I just wanted you to know it was there. She let him stand in it a moment. not cruel, just letting the words be real. Before she answered, "You learned my son's name for a horse," she said, "by lamplight, alone, thinking nobody saw." She stepped close. "A man doesn't do that for a season's work. Gideon Hart, I think you knew your intention a long while before today. I think I knew mine. And what's yours?" he said, rough. "To stay," she said, "same as you." He kissed her then, on the porch, in the last of the light. And 7 years of held breath went out of him all at once. They were wed in the fall, in Bellwether's full church. Josiah stood up for Gideon. Walks in 2 worlds, and her son sat in the pew that no Crow family had sat in before that summer, and now did, plain as anyone. Doc Whitman came, and Hollis, who'd lost his trade and his standing, for testifying and seemed, somehow, lighter for it. Even Miss Pruitt came, and signed her congratulations to the boy across the room. Slow and careful, and only a little wrong. And Toby grinned at her, getting it nearly right. And when the Reverend asked who gave the bride, it was Toby, who walked her up small and straight-backed in a new coat, his mother's hand in his, giving her over to the man who'd reined in his horse behind a depot one autumn morning because he'd heard somebody crying and couldn't, for the life of him, drive on. That night the house was full, lamplight in every window for once, instead of the one. And Gideon sat down to supper at the head of his own table, with a wife to one side and a boy to the other. And he did not stand at the counter. And he did not eat alone. And nobody made a thing of it, because it had stopped being a remarkable thing and become simply the way of the house. Later, on the porch, Toby asleep inside. Nell leaned against him in the dark. "They called you Heartless," she said, "all those years." "They did. I think they just never saw you stop." She found his scarred hand in the dark and held it. That's all it ever was. They saw a man who wouldn't open his door. They never saw the one time you rode into a blizzard for somebody, or the morning you reined in for a stranger. She was quiet a moment. Funny thing about people. They'll name you for the worst they ever saw, and never once ask what the worst was guarding. Gideon didn't answer right away. He was looking out at the dark, at the water he could hear running again, where the dam held, at the light spilling, warm from the open door behind them. "Your boy taught me something," he said finally. "First day, near. He couldn't hear a word I said, so I had to learn to say things with my hand. Slow wrong, mostly at first." He turned the thought over, and I got to figuring, maybe that's the whole of it, the whole lesson. Everybody's saying something. The widow crying where she thinks no one hears. The man the town won't sell to. Folks shoved papers they can't read. Boy, nobody troubled to learn. All of them saying something. Plain as day. The whole time, he shook his head. Slow. "We just keep deciding some folks aren't worth the trouble of learning how to hear. And we're wrong. Every time. We're wrong." "That's near a speech," Nell said softly. "Don't get used to it." She laughed. And he smiled, a real one, the kind that had been 7 years coming. And the two of them sat on the porch in the dark, while the water ran and the house glowed behind them. Some folks are saved by grand things, by battles and fortunes, and great strokes of luck. Gideon Hart and Nell Calloway were saved by smaller stuff, by a canteen set down in the dust, by a horse's name learned wrong by lamplight, by a dam rebuilt and a door left open, and a man who finally let people stand near his fire, by the daily, unremarkable, world-changing decision to stop and look and learn how to hear the one the world had quit listening to. That was the whole of it. That was enough. The author does not encourage or promote dangerous actions, illegal behavior, discrimination, or harmful conduct depicted in this story. Any conflicts, confrontations, or controversial themes shown are fictional elements designed to support the dramatic structure of the narrative.
This story reminds us that kindness does not always arrive with grand speeches or heroic music. Sometimes kindness is a canteen set down in the dust. Sometimes it is a clean handkerchief placed beside it. Sometimes it is a man learning a child's language by lamplight, getting the signs wrong, practicing anyway, because love often begins with the willingness to be clumsy for someone else's sake. Gideon did not save Nell and Toby by becoming perfect. He saved them and was saved by them because he chose not to drive on. He chose to look, he chose to listen, and in a world where so many people pass by pain because it is inconvenient, that choice becomes a kind of courage. Nell's journey carries its own powerful lesson. She was a widow, poor, tired, and judged by a town that had already decided what a woman alone was worth. Men like Dunmore looked at her land, her son, and her grief, and saw opportunity. They called their greed kindness. They dressed their threats as favors. But Nell knew the difference between rescue and control. She understood that her son's birthright was not something to be sold cheap, just because the world thought she had no strength left. Her courage was not loud at first. It was in the way she kept walking, kept working, kept counting what remained instead of only what had been taken. And in the end, she stood not only for land and water, but for the right of every overlooked person to say, "This is mine. This is my life. You do not get to decide it for me." And then there is Toby, the quiet heart of the story. The town thought that because he could not hear, he had no voice. The school thought he was a disruption. The cruel thought he was less than whole. But Toby saw what others missed. He remembered what others forgot. He spoke with his hands, with his eyes, with his drawings, with the kind of truth that does not need sound to be powerful. The great lesson Toby gives us is this: silence is not emptiness. Difference is not weakness. A person may speak in a way we do not understand, but that does not mean they have nothing to say. It only means we have not yet done the work of learning how to listen. That may be the deepest meaning of this story. So much harm in Calder Bluff came from people refusing to listen. They did not listen to the widow, not listen to the black foreman who knew what injustice looked like. They did not listen to the Crow family, whose land was being stolen one paper at a time. They did not listen to the deaf boy because they had already decided his truth was not worth hearing. And every time they chose not to listen, men like Dunmore grew stronger. Evil does not always begin with a gun in the street. Sometimes it begins with a closed door, a turned face, a polite excuse, a town saying, "That is not my affair." But the story also shows us that change begins the same way. One person opens the door. One person stops the wagon. One person tells the truth in daylight. One person chooses not to answer cruelty with fists in the dark, but with courage in front of the whole town. Gideon's fire could have destroyed him inside as hatred, and Josiah beside him. He learned to bank that fire into something warmer, something useful, something that could protect instead of consume. That is wisdom hard-earned. Anger can point us toward what is wrong, but only love, discipline, and truth can turn that anger into justice. By the end, Heart's Crossing is no longer just a ranch. It becomes a home built out of second chances. Nell finds safety without surrendering her dignity. Toby finds people willing to learn his voice. Gideon finds that grief does not have to be a coffin. Josiah walks in two worlds, Reverend Bellwether. And even those who came late to the truth all prove that a community can begin to heal when it finally makes room for the people it once pushed aside. So the value of this story is clear. Do not judge a soul by the name others have given them. Do not mistake quiet people for empty ones when it asks someone to give up what is rightfully theirs, and above all,